An FBI agent, a son who never forgot the pain in his mother's eyes. A police officer, a symbol of law who abused his power to humiliate and degrade. Two men on opposite sides of justice, entangled in a web of discrimination, revenge, and accountability. This isn't just a story of law enforcement, it's a story of redemption, a battle for respect, and a reckoning with the past. It all began on a warm afternoon in a crowded city square. A community festival was underway, a celebration of culture, resilience, and unity in a city that had long struggled to find peace. Families gathered, children played, and there was a feeling of hope in the air. But then, that hope was shattered. "Ma'am, step away from the table. You're under investigation," the voice boomed, cutting through the joyful music and chatter. Eyes turned, necks craned, and the festive mood drained from the square like air from a punctured balloon. Standing tall in his uniform, the officer's gaze was cold, sharp, and unyielding. His presence was intimidating, and he knew it. "What's this about?" she stammered, her hands trembling as she clutched the raffle tickets she had been selling all day. "I haven't done anything wrong." "That's not for you to decide," the officer sneered, stepping closer, his lips curling into a smirk. "We've had reports that you're selling counterfeit tickets. Fraud, deception. I suggest you come with me quietly." The crowd murmured, eyes darting between the officer and the woman. Some were shocked, some confused, but no one stepped forward. She looked around, searching for a familiar face, anyone who might stand up for her. But they all just stood there, silent, afraid. "Please, I've been volunteering here for years. I'm not selling anything fake," she pleaded, trying to keep her voice steady. But he wasn't listening. "Did you not hear me?" he barked, his voice rising as he grabbed her wrist, roughly pulling her towards the squad car parked nearby. "You think you can just come out here and cheat people out of their money? Not on my watch. You're going to learn what happens when you break the law in this city." It wasn't the accusation that cut the deepest. It was the look on his face, the way he handled her, as if she was nothing, just another piece of trash he had to clean up. "How many times do we have to deal with people like you?" he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for those nearby to hear, his tone dripping with disdain. "Always trying to play the victim." There it was. The quiet but clear sting of racism that everyone in that square could feel, even if they didn't dare say it out loud. As he pushed her into the back of the car, he made sure to make it a spectacle. "Let this be a lesson to anyone else thinking they can get away with this. We're not going to tolerate it." And just like that, the joy of the festival turned into a spectacle of humiliation. As the officer drove away, the crowd dispersed, and whispers filled the square. Nobody knew what to say. But one thing was clear, she was innocent. And she had been made an example of. Little did the officer know, that day would set off a chain of events that would lead to his downfall. Because there was someone watching, someone who remembered every word, every gesture, every cruel smirk. Her son, a man who had worked his entire life to protect and serve justice, stood at the edge of the square, hidden in the shadows, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. He had seen everything, and he felt the sting of those words as if they were aimed directly at him. He had grown up seeing his mother face prejudice, seeing her dignity trampled on by people who thought they could because of the color of her skin. He had made a promise to himself that one day, he would make things right. And now, he was in a position to do something about it. But this wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, justice for his mother, and for every person who had been targeted, humiliated, and silenced. He knew the system. He had seen how it worked from the inside, and he knew how to take it apart, piece by piece. The officer thought he was untouchable, that he could use his badge to hide behind his actions. But the agent had connections, knowledge, and a determination that could not be shaken. This wasn't just about bringing a bad cop to justice. It was about sending a message, that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. The investigation began quietly, under the radar. Old records were dusted off, witnesses were approached discreetly, and soon, a pattern of abuse and intimidation started to emerge. This officer wasn't just a man having a bad day, he had a history, a record of targeting minorities, of using his position to instill fear. And for too long, he had gotten away with it. But not this time. As the investigation unfolded, secrets came to light, and alliances began to shift. People who had once turned a blind eye were forced to confront the truth. The officer tried to push back, using every trick in the book to discredit the investigation, but it was no use. The evidence was overwhelming, and as the case moved to court, the city held its breath, waiting to see if justice would finally be served. The day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, families, all eyes were on the officer as he walked in, still clinging to his bravado, still trying to act as though he was untouchable. But he was about to learn that when you cross the line, there's always a price to pay. The prosecutor stood up, a calm yet firm expression on their face. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not just about one officer's actions on a single day. It's about a pattern, a system of behavior that has been allowed to continue unchecked. But today, we say enough. And as they presented the evidence, as witness after witness took the stand, the truth came crashing down. This wasn't just a case of false accusations. It was about power, control, and the abuse of a badge that was meant to protect, not destroy. The more they spoke, the paler the officer's face became, the more his mask of confidence cracked. But what no one knew, what hadn't been revealed yet, was the twist that would leave the courtroom, and the entire city, in shock. A final piece of evidence, a document so damning that even the officer's staunchest defenders couldn't deny it. What did they find that turned the case on its head? And how did a mother's quiet dignity lead to the downfall of a man who thought he was untouchable? The answer is what you've been waiting to hear, and it's a story that will remind you, justice, though it may be slow, will always find its way. Stay tuned, because this is a story of justice, redemption, and the kind of courage that can change everything. Hey everyone, before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to send a message of support to our Black community. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. Our stories shine a light on the struggles many face, but also on the strength, resilience, and victories that come from overcoming those challenges. We hope this narrative resonates with you and reminds you that justice is possible. Thank you for being here with us. We appreciate your support, and if you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. Malcolm sat at the edge of his bed, staring at a framed photo that rested on his nightstand. It was an old picture, one of his mother, Darlene, smiling brightly at a community event. Her eyes sparkled with the kind of warmth and resilience that had always made people feel welcome, no matter who they were. For Malcolm, that smile was a symbol of strength. Growing up in Detroit, he had seen firsthand how hard his mother had worked to provide for them, often juggling 2 jobs and volunteering at local events. She was the kind of person who believed in building community, even when life hadn't always been kind to her. From a young age, Malcolm understood the weight of being different. The son of a single Black mother in a city that was trying, but often failing, to recover from years of economic struggle, he knew what it meant to fight for respect. While others saw Detroit as a city of abandoned buildings and broken dreams, Malcolm saw resilience. It was in the people who showed up day after day, hustling to make ends meet, and in his mother, who never stopped believing in the power of community. Darlene's dedication to her community wasn't just a part-time commitment, it was her life's work. She organized neighborhood cleanups, helped set up food drives, and every year, she volunteered at the city's cultural festival. It was her way of giving back, of showing that even when the world seemed dark, there were still good people trying to make a difference. But it was also at that festival where everything changed, where a moment of cruelty turned Malcolm's world upside down. Malcolm had always admired his mother's spirit, but he chose a different path to make a difference. After studying criminal justice, he joined the FBI, becoming one of the few black agents in his department. It wasn't an easy journey. He faced countless obstacles, whispers behind his back, and moments when he felt he had to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal. But he did it for her, for the promise he had made to himself as a teenager when he saw her being disrespected, ignored, and underestimated by those who should have treated her better. Now, Malcolm had built a reputation for himself. He was methodical, sharp, and calm under pressure. But beneath that professional exterior was a man who had never forgotten his roots, who carried the weight of every injustice he had seen and the hope that one day, he could change things. Yet, no amount of success could have prepared him for what he witnessed that afternoon. It was supposed to be a celebration. The annual Detroit Cultural Festival was more than just an event, it was a lifeline for the community. People from all walks of life came together to share food, music, and stories, creating a sense of unity that was hard to find in a city so often divided by invisible lines. This year, like every other, Darlene had volunteered to help organize the event. She was in charge of the raffle, a simple but important part of raising funds for local charities. But what should have been a day of joy quickly turned into a nightmare. Officer Richard Carson was a man who commanded respect, or rather, he demanded it. A veteran on the Detroit police force, he was known for his strict, no-nonsense approach to law enforcement. But there was more to Richard than met the eye. Underneath the polished exterior of his uniform was a man who thrived on control. He had made a career out of pushing the limits, of using his badge as a shield to do things his way. He knew the system inside out, and he used it to his advantage, especially when it came to people he thought of as lesser. Richard wasn't from Detroit originally, he had transferred from a smaller town where things were quieter, simpler. Here, in the city, he saw chaos. And he didn't like chaos. He saw people like Darlene as part of the problem, people who tried to bring attention to issues he thought were better left ignored. To him, the festival was just another disruption, and when he saw Darlene, he saw an opportunity to remind everyone who was really in charge. As Darlene handed out raffle tickets with her usual warm smile, Richard approached her, his expression hard. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the booth," he said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding crowd. "We've received reports that you're selling counterfeit tickets." Darlene looked up, confused but calm. "I don't understand," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "These tickets were provided by the festival organizers. I'm just helping raise money for the community." "That's not what I'm hearing," Richard shot back, his lips curling into a smirk. "We've got witnesses saying you've been pocketing the money. So why don't you save us all some time and come with me?" The accusation was absurd, and Darlene knew it. But as she tried to explain, Richard stepped closer, invading her space, his hand moving to his belt as if ready to restrain her. "Are you resisting?" he asked, his voice low but dripping with menace. The way he said it, the way he looked at her, made it clear that he wanted a scene. And soon, he got one. People began to gather, some pulling out their phones, others murmuring in disbelief. But no one stepped in. Malcolm, who had arrived at the festival to surprise his mother, watched from a distance, his heart pounding as he took in the scene. He could see the fear in her eyes, the way she tried to stay composed even as Richard's accusations grew louder, harsher. He knew what was happening. He had seen it before, and it made his blood boil. But Malcolm didn't move. Not yet. He watched as Richard dragged his mother away, as she looked back, searching the crowd for a familiar face, for someone who would step up and say, "This isn't right." And no one did. For Malcolm, it was a moment of clarity, a reminder of why he had chosen this path, of what he had sworn to fight against. He knew then that this wasn't just about a bad cop on a power trip. It was about a system that allowed people like Richard to thrive, to bully and intimidate without consequence. That night, Malcolm made a decision. He would not let this go. He would use every resource, every contact, every ounce of determination he had to make sure that Richard Carson faced the consequences of his actions. Because this wasn't just about justice for his mother. It was about every person who had been silenced, every voice that had been ignored. And Malcolm was going to make sure that those voices were finally heard. The next day, he began his work quietly, methodically. He didn't want to draw attention, not yet. He knew Richard was careful, that he had covered his tracks. But Malcolm was patient, and he had a lifetime of experience in uncovering the truth. What he didn't know, as he started pulling on the threads of Richard's past, was just how deep the corruption ran, or how far Richard would go to protect his secrets. But Malcolm was ready. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life, and he wasn't about to back down now. The city of Detroit was about to witness a battle for justice, one that would expose not just one man's abuses, but the flaws of a system that had let it happen for far too long. Malcolm spent the next few days going through motions that had become second nature to him. He filed reports, attended briefings, and conducted routine investigations, all while keeping his true intentions hidden. But in the quiet hours, when the office was almost empty, he was a man on a mission. With every document he pulled, every call he made, he was inching closer to uncovering the truth about Richard Carson. He couldn't afford mistakes. This wasn't just another case, it was personal, and Malcolm knew he had to play it smart. He started by gathering witness statements. The day after the incident at the festival, Malcolm reached out to people he recognized in the crowd, asking them to recount what they had seen. Most were hesitant, but there were a few who spoke up, and their words only confirmed what Malcolm already knew. Richard had no grounds to accuse his mother, and it was clear his actions had been driven by something more than a sense of duty. Malcolm's next step was to dig into Richard's records. He accessed public complaints, internal memos, anything that could point to a history of misconduct. And it didn't take long for him to find what he was looking for. There were multiple reports, scattered over the years, of Richard targeting minority groups. They were always dismissed or marked as resolved, but Malcolm knew that was often code for swept under the rug. The more he read, the more he realized that Richard was not an outlier. He was a product of a system that had let him get away with this behavior for years. One evening, as Malcolm sat at his desk, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah, a local journalist who had been following issues of police misconduct for years. Malcolm had reached out to her discreetly, knowing she could be a valuable ally. She had a knack for finding stories others couldn't, and more importantly, she wasn't afraid to tell them. The message read, "Meet me at the diner on 3rd, got something you'll want to see." Malcolm arrived at the diner, a small, nondescript place that was mostly empty except for a couple of regulars sipping their coffee. Sarah was in a booth at the back, her laptop open, a cup of coffee in her hand. She looked up as he approached, giving him a quick nod. "I've been digging," she said, sliding her laptop over to him. "And I think I found something you're going to like." On the screen was a series of emails, exchanges between Richard and other officers. The language was coded, but the implications were clear. They talked about cleaning up certain neighborhoods, about keeping things quiet, and there were mentions of necessary force. But the most damning piece was a conversation where Richard complained about having to deal with people like her at the festival, saying he'd make an example out of her if it's the last thing he does. Malcolm's jaw tightened as he read the words. It was all there, proof that this wasn't a one-time incident but part of a pattern. He leaned back, taking a deep breath. "How did you get these?" he asked. Sarah smirked. "I have my ways. Let's just say there are people on the inside who aren't as fond of Carson as he thinks. But this is just the beginning. If you want to take him down, you'll need more than a few emails." "I know," Malcolm said, his voice low but resolute. "But it's a start. Can you get me more?" Sarah nodded. "I can try. But you need to be careful, Malcolm. If Carson gets wind of this, he won't just sit back and wait for you to take him down. He's got connections, people who will back him up no matter what. You're going to need more than just evidence. You'll need support." "I've got support," Malcolm said, his eyes meeting hers. But I'll take any help you can give me. The next few weeks were a blur of late nights and quiet meetings. Malcolm worked tirelessly, combing through records, reaching out to old contacts, and slowly building his case. He knew he couldn't do it alone, so he started gathering allies, people within the system who had seen Richard's behavior but had been too afraid or unable to speak out. Slowly but surely, he was piecing together a picture that was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Richard began to sense that something was wrong. He noticed the glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when he walked into the room. At first, he brushed it off, assuming it was just another day at the station. But then he heard about the questions, about Malcolm looking into old cases, and he knew he had to act fast. One afternoon, Richard called Malcolm into his office. "Sit down," he said, motioning to the chair opposite his desk. Malcolm hesitated but complied, keeping his expression neutral. "I've been hearing some things," Richard began, leaning back in his chair. "People are saying you've been asking around about me. I don't know what you think you're going to find, but I'd advise you to be careful. You don't want to make enemies, especially not ones like me." Malcolm met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm just doing my job," he said calmly. "Making sure everything is in order." "Is that so?" Richard said, a cold smile spreading across his face. "Well, let me give you a piece of advice, Agent. Sometimes, it's better not to dig too deep. You might not like what you find." The tension in the room was palpable, but Malcolm refused to back down. "Or maybe I'll find exactly what I'm looking for," he said, his voice steady. "And when I do, I'll make sure everyone knows." Richard's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of anger. "You think you can take me down? You're out of your depth, kid. I've been in this game a lot longer than you have, and I know how to play it. So why don't you drop this little crusade of yours before it gets you into trouble?" Malcolm stood up, his eyes never leaving Richard's. "I'm not afraid of trouble," he said. "And I'm not afraid of you." As Malcolm walked out of the office, he could feel Richard's eyes boring into his back, but he didn't care. He was closer than ever, and he wasn't about to stop now. The confrontation had only made him more determined, more certain that he was on the right path. But he also knew that Richard wasn't going to go down without a fight. The pressure was mounting, and Malcolm could feel the walls closing in around him. Every step forward seemed to come with a new obstacle, a new threat. But he had spent his whole life overcoming challenges, and he wasn't about to let this one break him. What he didn't know, though, was just how deep Richard's connections ran, or how far he was willing to go to protect himself. Sarah called him a few days later, her voice tense. "I've got something big," she said. "But you need to see it in person. Meet me at the usual spot." Malcolm's heart raced as he hung up the phone. He could feel it, the breakthrough he had been waiting for, just within his grasp. But there was a nagging fear, a sense that things were about to get even more dangerous. As he made his way to the diner, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something bigger than he had anticipated. The stakes were higher than ever, and he was about to find out just how far Richard was willing to go to keep his secrets buried. Malcolm arrived at the diner just as the sun dipped below the Detroit skyline, casting long shadows across the streets. The place was mostly empty, just the hum of a coffee machine and the quiet murmur of a couple of regulars at the counter. He spotted Sarah in their usual booth at the back, a serious expression on her face as she scanned the documents spread out in front of her. She barely looked up when he approached, her eyes still focused on the papers. "You got something?" Malcolm asked, sliding into the seat across from her, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and dread. Sarah nodded, finally meeting his eyes. "I've been digging, like you asked. And I found something, bigger than either of us could have imagined." She took a deep breath, pushing a thick file towards him. "This is everything. Emails, witness testimonies, financial records. It's not just Carson, Malcolm. He's part of a network, a group within the force that's been covering up misconduct, tampering with evidence, and targeting people like your mother for years. Malcolm's hands tightened around the edge of the file. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the words but barely processing them. It was worse than he'd thought. Names he recognized, officers he'd seen at the precinct, all connected to a web of corruption that had allowed Richard to act with impunity. There were payouts, altered reports, even internal complaints that had been buried. And right at the center of it all was Richard Carson. This is massive, Malcolm said, his voice barely a whisper. But if we're going to take him down, we need to be smart about this. We need to make sure everything sticks. Sarah nodded. I've already talked to a few people, quietly. They're scared, but they're willing to testify if they can be guaranteed protection. We can't just go after Carson. We need to expose the entire system that's been protecting him. Malcolm leaned back, running a hand over his face. He could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him, the realization that this wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about the whole city, about every person who had been mistreated, harassed, or ignored. And he was about to ignite a firestorm. We have to be ready for pushback, he said finally. If Carson gets wind of this, he'll do everything he can to bury it. Sarah's eyes were sharp. Then we don't give him a chance to. We go public, and we do it fast. The next morning, Malcolm stood in a quiet corner of the FBI office, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke with a federal prosecutor. I'm sending over everything we have, he said, his voice steady but tense. You'll see the connections. We have enough to launch an investigation, but we need to move now. If we wait, they'll start covering their tracks. The prosecutor agreed, and Malcolm ended the call, his mind racing with 100 different thoughts. This was it. There was no turning back now. He was taking on more than just a corrupt cop, he was challenging a system that had allowed people like Carson to operate unchecked for far too long. Later that evening, Malcolm sat across from his mother in her small, cozy living room, trying to explain everything without overwhelming her. Darlene listened quietly, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and pride. So, this is it, she said softly, once he had finished. You're going to take him down. I have to, Malcolm replied. For you, for everyone who's ever been hurt by him. But it's going to get messy, Mom. I need you to be ready. Darlene reached across the table, placing a hand on his. I'm proud of you, Malcolm. I always have been. But promise me you'll be careful. I don't want to see you get hurt. I will, he said, squeezing her hand. I promise. The trial was set for a chilly Monday morning, and by the time Malcolm arrived at the courthouse, a crowd had already gathered outside. There were reporters, activists, and curious onlookers, all waiting to see how the case would unfold. Malcolm could feel the eyes on him as he walked through the throng, but he kept his head down, focusing on what lay ahead. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation. Richard Carson sat at the defense table, his face stony, eyes cold as they met Malcolm's across the room. He looked calm, but Malcolm could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the way his fingers tapped nervously against the edge of the table. He wasn't as confident as he wanted everyone to believe. As the trial began, the prosecutor laid out the case, detailing years of misconduct and cover-ups. One by one, witnesses took the stand, each recounting their own experiences of harassment and intimidation. Malcolm listened, feeling a mix of anger and sorrow as the stories poured out. It was a painful reminder of how many people had suffered in silence, but also a sign that things were finally changing. Then came the moment Malcolm had been waiting for. Sarah had managed to secure one final piece of evidence, a recording from a former officer who had worked closely with Richard. The recording had been made without Richard's knowledge, and in it, he could be heard discussing how he had handled the situation at the festival, bragging about how easy it was to make people like Darlene disappear into the system. The courtroom was silent as the recording played, the words echoing off the walls like a dark confession. Richard's face went pale, and Malcolm watched as the mask of control he had worn for so long began to slip. He could see the fear, the realization that he was no longer untouchable, that the system he had relied on was crumbling around him. Richard's defense attorney tried to object, but the damage was done. The judge allowed the recording to be admitted as evidence, and Malcolm could see the jury's expressions harden as they listened. This wasn't just about corruption, it was about abuse of power, about a man who had used his position to hurt others because he thought he could get away with it. When it was Malcolm's turn to testify, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to say. He spoke clearly, recounting what he had seen at the festival, the way Richard had humiliated his mother, and the long months he had spent gathering evidence. "This isn't just about one bad officer," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about a system that has allowed people like him to thrive, to abuse their power without fear of consequence. But it has to stop. Today, we have a chance to make sure it stops." Richard watched him, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and fear. For a moment, it looked like he might lash out, but he stayed silent, his jaw clenched so tight Malcolm could see the veins throbbing in his neck. During a break in the trial, Malcolm found himself face to face with Richard in the hallway. It was a tense, almost surreal moment, the two of them standing just a few feet apart, with nothing but the cold air between them. "You think this is over?" Richard hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You think you can ruin me and just walk away?" Malcolm met his gaze, unflinching. "It's over, Carson. You've spent your whole life hiding behind that badge, but you can't hide anymore. People are finally seeing you for what you are." Richard took a step closer, his expression twisting into a sneer. "You're just like the rest of them," he said. "You think you're making a difference, but you're nothing. This city doesn't care about people like you." Malcolm didn't flinch. He had heard words like these all his life, and he was done letting them define him. "Maybe they didn't before," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But they do now. And that's because of people like my mother, who never stopped fighting, even when people like you tried to silence them." The words hung in the air, heavy and defiant, and for a moment, Richard seemed to deflate, the bravado slipping away as he realized that he had lost. There was no escape, no more tricks left to play. The evidence was out, and the people he had hurt were finally having their voices heard. When the trial resumed, the jury delivered their verdict. Richard Carson was found guilty on multiple charges, including abuse of power and falsification of evidence. As the judge read the sentence, a murmur rippled through the courtroom, a mix of relief and disbelief. It was a moment that had been years in the making, a moment of long overdue justice. As Richard was led away, Malcolm allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. It wasn't just about winning. It was about proving that change was possible, that even the most deeply rooted systems of corruption could be challenged and dismantled. He had kept his promise, to his mother and to himself. And as he left the courthouse, stepping out into the bright afternoon light, he knew that this was only the beginning. The air outside the courthouse was electric, buzzing with anticipation and the hum of reporters' questions. Cameras flashed, microphones jostled for space, and the crowd had only grown since the trial began. But Malcolm wasn't thinking about any of that as he watched Richard being led away, handcuffed, his head lowered. It was a sight Malcolm had imagined 1,000 times, but seeing it in reality brought a different feeling, a mix of triumph and somber reflection. He turned to find his mother, Darlene, standing at the back of the courtroom. Her eyes were glistening, but she smiled, a proud, relieved smile that made all the sleepless nights, all the tension and fear, worth it. Malcolm walked over to her, and she pulled him into a tight hug. "You did it, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." Malcolm held her close, feeling the warmth of her embrace. "We did it, Mom. This was for you. For everyone." As they stepped outside, the flashes of cameras grew brighter, and a wave of reporters surged toward them. Malcolm could barely catch his breath before a reporter thrust a microphone in his face. "Agent Malcolm, how do you feel now that Richard Carson has been found guilty? Did you ever expect it to end like this?" Malcolm hesitated, glancing at his mother before turning back to the reporter. "I feel relieved," he said, choosing his words carefully. "This isn't just about one man being held accountable. It's about justice, about giving a voice to those who have been silenced for too long. And this is just the beginning. There's still a lot of work to be done." As he spoke, Malcolm's eyes drifted to the side of the courthouse steps, where he spotted Sarah standing, watching him with a small, knowing smile. She had been there every step of the way, helping him piece together the evidence, guiding him through the murky waters of the case. Without her, none of this would have been possible. Sarah approached, and the two shared a brief, silent nod. There was no need for words, they both understood the gravity of what had just happened. But before Malcolm could say anything, a familiar voice cut through the crowd, sharp and angry. "You think you're a hero, don't you?" Malcolm's head snapped around, and there, just beyond the line of officers, was Richard, his face twisted with rage. Even in handcuffs, even after everything, he still had that sneer, that look of disdain. For a moment, the officers hesitated, unsure whether to pull him back or let him speak, but Richard took the opportunity to vent his fury. "You're nothing," he spat, his voice rising, drawing the attention of the crowd. "This is all just a game to you, isn't it? You think putting me away is going to change anything? You're deluding yourself. This system isn't going anywhere, and neither are people like me." The word stung, but Malcolm didn't react. He had heard these kinds of threats before, the taunts meant to undermine, to provoke. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his eyes steady, unyielding. "You're right, Carson," Malcolm said, his voice calm, but with an edge that cut through the noise. "The system doesn't change overnight. But today, we took the first step. And you're going to be a part of that change, whether you like it or not." Richard's eyes burned with fury, his lips curling into a snarl. "You think you can erase me? I've got people who will back me up. Friends in high places. You haven't won, Malcolm. You've just started a war you can't finish." Malcolm's expression remained steady, but he felt the anger simmering beneath the surface. He thought of the years his mother had spent trying to make a difference, of all the times she had been dismissed, ignored, belittled. And now, here was the man who had humiliated her, trying to deflect, to escape responsibility once again. "I'm not trying to erase you, Carson," Malcolm said, his voice tightening with restrained emotion. "I'm holding you accountable. For every person you hurt, every lie you told, every abuse of power you thought you could get away with. You did this to yourself. And now, for the first time, you're going to face the consequences." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word, and for a moment, even Richard seemed to falter, his sneer wavering as the reality of his situation began to sink in. "I hope you're proud of yourself," he muttered, almost as if to himself, his gaze darting around, looking for something to anchor himself to. "Dragging your own people into this mess. What kind of a man are you?" Malcolm's jaw clenched, but he didn't let the words sway him. "I'm the kind of man who doesn't let people like you get away with hurting others," he said. "And if that makes me your enemy, then so be it." Richard glared at him, but there was nothing left for him to say. The officers began to escort him to the waiting police car, but as they did, Richard shouted over his shoulder, one last attempt to hold on to whatever shred of control he thought he had left. "This isn't over, Malcolm. You hear me? It's not over." The words echoed, lingering in the crisp air, but they sounded hollow, empty. Malcolm watched as Richard was pushed into the back seat of the car, the door slamming shut with a finality that was almost poetic. Sarah stepped up beside Malcolm, her expression somber but resolute. "He's going to try to fight this," she said quietly. "You know that, right? He's not the kind to just go down without a fight." I know, Malcolm replied, his eyes still fixed on the police car as it pulled away, disappearing into the distance. But he's not in control anymore. And that's what matters. A few days later, Malcolm found himself back at the diner, this time sitting across from a group of community leaders, activists, and some of the people who had testified during the trial. The mood was one of cautious optimism, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. Darlene sat beside him, her presence a quiet but powerful reminder of why they were all there. As the meeting began, the conversation shifted to what would come next. There was still so much work to be done: reform, rebuilding trust, ensuring that no one else would have to endure what they had been through. "I'm not going to pretend that this solves everything," Malcolm said, addressing the group. "But we've seen what can happen when people come together, when they refuse to be silenced. Carson was just one man, but there are others like him, and we need to keep fighting. Not just in the courts, but out there, in our communities, every single day." Darlene nodded, her hand resting gently on his arm. "We have to keep moving forward. One step at a time," she said, her voice steady, filled with the quiet strength that had always defined her. "This city needs us, and we can't let fear stop us from doing what's right." Malcolm looked around the table, seeing the faces of people who had risked so much to stand up for what they believed in. He saw the hope, the determination, and he knew that this was just the beginning. As the meeting came to an end, Malcolm stepped outside, letting the cool night air wash over him. He felt lighter, as if a weight he had carried for years had finally been lifted. But there was still a part of him that couldn't shake the memory of Richard's final words, the bitterness in his voice. Sarah joined him outside, leaning against the wall. "You did good, Malcolm," she said. "Better than most people would have." "I don't know about that," Malcolm said with a small smile. "I just did what I had to do." "Exactly," Sarah said, her eyes glinting with that familiar, fiery determination. "And sometimes, that's more than enough." For a moment, they stood there in silence, both lost in their thoughts. Then, Sarah broke the quiet, her voice softer. "You're going to be a target now, you know that, right? Carson might be gone, but there are others who aren't going to be happy about this." "I know," Malcolm said, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the city lights flickered like stars. "But if I've learned anything, it's that you can't let fear stop you. Not when there's so much at stake." Sarah smiled, a genuine, warm smile that lit up her face. "Well, just know you're not alone. There are a lot of people who believe in what you're doing. Myself included." Malcolm glanced at her, grateful. "Thank you, Sarah. For everything." "You don't have to thank me," she said, nudging his shoulder playfully. "Just promise me you'll keep fighting. Because this city needs people like you, even if they don't always realize it." Malcolm nodded, feeling a sense of resolve settle over him. "I will. I promise." As he stood there, looking out over the city he had fought so hard to protect, he knew that the road ahead was still long, still filled with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was walking it with a purpose, a clear vision of the future he wanted to help build. And no matter how many obstacles came his way, he was ready to face them, knowing that he wasn't alone. As the weeks went by, the aftermath of Richard Carson's trial continued to ripple through the city. The story was everywhere, on TV, in newspapers, all over social media. For many, it was a moment of reckoning, a sign that no one, not even those in positions of power, was above the law. For others, it was a painful reminder of the injustice they had been forced to live with, a bittersweet victory that still left much to be done. Malcolm found himself at the center of it all. Reporters called him a hero, activists praised his courage, and community leaders sought him out for advice. But for Malcolm, it was a strange and uneasy spotlight. He hadn't set out to be a hero, he just wanted justice for his mother and for the community that had been ignored for too long. Yet, as the attention grew, so did the complexities of what came next. One evening, Malcolm sat in a quiet room at the FBI office, staring at a stack of case files that had been accumulating on his desk. These weren't just about Richard Carson anymore. They were about others, officers who had been named in the investigation, complaints that had been reopened, and new allegations that had surfaced now that people felt safe enough to speak out. It was as if Carson's fall had broken open a dam, and all the hidden, festering truths were rushing out, demanding to be acknowledged. He sighed, running a hand over his face, feeling the weight of it all. The victory in court hadn't brought the sense of closure he thought it would. If anything, it had exposed just how deeply the corruption ran, and now there was a choice to be made. He could keep pushing, knowing it would only get harder, or he could step back and let others take the lead. But as much as the idea of stepping back was tempting, Malcolm knew he couldn't do it. This was bigger than him, and it would take more than a single trial to set things right. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He looked up to see Agent Simmons, his supervisor, standing there. Simmons was an older man, with a stern, no-nonsense demeanor, but there was a softness in his eyes that Malcolm had come to recognize as respect. "Got a minute?" Simmons asked, stepping into the room. Malcolm nodded, motioning for him to sit. "What's up?" Simmons sat down, placing a file on the table between them. "I've been reviewing the fallout from Carson's case, and it's clear that you've opened up something we're not going to be able to ignore. We've got more complaints coming in, people willing to testify, and I'm getting pressure from above to address this head-on. You've stirred the pot, Malcolm, and now we're facing the consequences." "I know," Malcolm said quietly. "And I'm willing to see this through." Simmons studied him for a moment, then leaned forward, his expression serious. "But there's more to it than that. We're not just talking about bad cops anymore. We're talking about an entire system that's been complicit in this kind of behavior for years. If we push forward, we're going to be taking on people with a lot of power, people who won't hesitate to push back. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of fight?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. "I'm sure. This isn't just about Carson. It's about everyone like him who's been using their power to hurt others. If we don't address the root of the problem, we're just going to keep seeing this happen again and again." Simmons nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer but still needed to hear it. "All right," he said. "But you need to understand, this isn't going to be like the last time. We're not just going to be taking a few people to court. We're going to be digging into the entire system, and there are going to be consequences. You need to be prepared for that." "I am," Malcolm said, his voice firm. "Whatever it takes." Simmons stood up, giving him a small nod of approval. "Then let's get to work. There's a lot that needs to be done, and it's not going to be easy. But if anyone can handle it, it's you." As the investigation expanded, Malcolm found himself juggling more than he ever had before. He was coordinating with other agencies, reaching out to communities for support, and dealing with the inevitable backlash from those who felt threatened by the changes. There were whispers about retaliation, about powerful figures who weren't happy with the way things were going, but Malcolm kept pushing forward, driven by a sense of purpose that had only grown stronger since the trial. But one evening, as he was leaving the office, he received a call that sent a chill down his spine. It was from Sarah, her voice strained, almost frantic. "Malcolm, you need to get to your mom's house. Now." Malcolm's heart dropped. "What's going on? Is she okay?" "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice barely concealing the panic. "But I got a tip that someone's been asking questions about her, trying to find out where she lives. I think it might be connected to the investigation. Just, please, get there as soon as you can." Malcolm didn't wait for her to say anything else. He grabbed his keys and ran out to his car, his mind racing as he sped through the streets of Detroit. It had never occurred to him that his mother might be in danger, but now that the thought was there, it was all he could focus on. He had seen what people in power were capable of, and the idea that they might try to hurt her to get to him made his blood run cold. When he pulled up to his mother's house, he saw a familiar car parked outside. His stomach clenched, but as he got closer, he realized it was Sarah, standing on the porch with a worried look on her face. "Sarah," he said, rushing up to her. "What's going on? Have you seen her?" Sarah nodded, relief washing over her face. "She's inside. I got here just after you left the office. I didn't want to risk anything, so I stayed until you got here." Malcolm pushed past her, barely hearing the words as he rushed inside. "Mom," he called, his voice louder than he intended. "Mom, where are you?" "In here, baby," Darlene's voice came from the kitchen, calm and steady, as if nothing was wrong. But when Malcolm entered, he saw her sitting at the table, her hands folded in front of her, and he knew something had happened. "Mom," he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "Are you okay? Did someone come by?" Darlene looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and defiance. "Someone came by, yes," she said quietly. "He said he was looking for you. Wanted to know if I could pass on a message." Malcolm's chest tightened. "What did he say?" "He said," Darlene began, her voice steady but laced with tension, "that if you don't back off, if you don't stop whatever it is you're doing, there will be consequences. For me, for you, for everyone." Malcolm felt a surge of anger, hot and uncontrollable, rising up inside him. He had known there would be pushback, but this, threatening his mother, was a line he hadn't expected them to cross. "Did you see his face? Did he say who he was?" "No," Darlene said, shaking her head. "He just left the message and walked away." "But Malcolm, you need to be careful. I don't want to see you get hurt because of this." Malcolm clenched his fists, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I'm not backing down, Mom. I can't. They want to scare me, but all they've done is given me more reason to keep going. They can't keep getting away with this." Darlene reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I know you're strong, and I'm proud of you for standing up to them. But promise me you'll be careful. I can't lose you, Malcolm." Malcolm looked into her eyes, seeing the fear, but also the unwavering strength that had always defined her. "I promise," he said softly. "I won't let them hurt you. I won't let them win." Sarah, who had been standing quietly by the doorway, stepped forward. "Malcolm, we need to be smart about this. They're trying to intimidate you, and if we let them see that it's working, they'll just keep pushing. But if we can expose them, show that they're resorting to threats because they're scared, it could turn things around." Malcolm nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. "We need to get this on record," he said, his voice resolute. "If they're willing to go this far, it means we're getting close to something big. We can use that. We'll make sure everyone knows exactly what they're trying to do." As the three of them sat down to plan their next move, Malcolm could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was caught in a battle that was bigger than he had ever imagined, facing opponents who would stop at nothing to protect their power. But he wasn't alone, and for the first time, he could see a way forward, a path that would lead to real change. He just had to be willing to keep fighting, no matter what it cost. And as he looked at his mother and Sarah, he knew that he was. The day had finally come. The culmination of months of investigations, countless sleepless nights, and a relentless pursuit of justice. Malcolm stood in the crowded courtroom, his heart pounding as he awaited the judge's final decision. The entire city had been following the case, and it felt like all eyes were on him. Beside him sat Sarah, calm and steady, a quiet pillar of strength that had kept him grounded throughout this entire ordeal. In the back, his mother, Darlene, sat with her hands clasped together, her expression a mix of pride and nervous anticipation. The investigation had uncovered a network of corruption that went far beyond Richard Carson. Through records, testimonies, and covert recordings, Malcolm and his team had exposed a group of high-ranking officials who had been manipulating the system, covering up misconduct, and silencing those who tried to speak out. It was bigger than they had imagined, but it also meant that justice was within reach. The courtroom fell silent as the judge began to speak, reading out the verdicts one by one. Richard Carson was found guilty on multiple counts of abuse of power, tampering with evidence, and issuing threats to obstruct justice. But he wasn't the only one. The investigation had led to the indictment of several others within the police department, men who had been part of the system that allowed Richard to operate unchecked. One by one, the judge listed their names, and with each guilty verdict, Malcolm felt a sense of vindication, a weight lifting off his shoulders. As the final verdict was read, the judge looked up, her gaze sweeping across the room. This case is a reminder that justice cannot be selective. It applies to everyone, no matter their position or status. Today, we have shown that when people stand together against wrongdoing, change is not only possible, it is inevitable. The courtroom erupted in a mix of applause and murmurs. Malcolm allowed himself a small, relieved smile, his eyes misting as he glanced back at his mother. Darlene's eyes were shining, and she gave him a nod, a simple but powerful gesture that said more than words ever could. She had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it was difficult, and now, her son had helped bring that belief to life in a way she could never have imagined. After the trial, as the crowd began to disperse, Malcolm found himself face to face with Richard one last time. The officers were leading Richard away, his hands cuffed, but he stopped when he saw Malcolm, his eyes filled with a mix of defiance and resignation. "You think you've won, don't you?" Richard said, his voice low, almost a growl. "You think this changes anything? People like me, we're not going away." Malcolm looked at him, calm, steady. "No, it doesn't change everything. But it's a start," he said. "And that's enough for now. Because for once, people like you have to answer for what you've done. And that's a change worth fighting for." Richard sneered, but there was no power behind it anymore. The arrogance that had once defined him had been stripped away, leaving only a hollow shell of a man who had lost everything. Malcolm watched as he was led out of the building, knowing that this was not just an end for Richard but a beginning for the city, a chance to rebuild, to heal, to ensure that no one would ever have to go through what his mother had endured. Later that evening, Malcolm returned to the community center where it had all begun. There was a small gathering, a celebration of sorts, organized by the people who had supported him throughout the trial. The atmosphere was warm, hopeful, filled with laughter and music, a stark contrast to the tension and fear that had hung over the city for so long. Malcolm was standing by the refreshment table when Darlene came up to him, her smile radiant. "You did good, Malcolm," she said softly, pulling him into a hug. "I always knew you had it in you." Malcolm hugged her back, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the moment sink in. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom," he said. "You gave me the strength to keep going." They stood there for a while, just enjoying the simple act of being together. Around them, the celebration continued, a testament to the resilience of the community, to the power of standing up and refusing to be silenced. Sarah joined them a little later, a glass of punch in hand. "So, what's next for the hero of Detroit?" she teased, her eyes twinkling. "Thinking of running for mayor or something?" Malcolm laughed, shaking his head. "No, I think I'll leave politics to someone else. I've had enough drama for a lifetime." "But seriously," Sarah said, her tone softening, "you did something incredible, Malcolm. You gave people hope. That's not something that happens every day." Malcolm nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not over, though. There's still a lot of work to do. But we've taken the first step, and that means everything." And there it is, the story of a son who stood up for his mother, of a community that refused to stay silent, and of a city that began to heal. This story isn't just about Malcolm's fight, it's about the fight for justice that happens every day, in every corner of the world. It's about standing up, even when the odds are against you, and believing that change is possible, no matter how difficult it may seem. We've seen how easy it is for those in power to abuse their position, to intimidate and silence those who speak out. But we've also seen that courage, resilience, and unity can bring even the most powerful to their knees. It's not an easy journey, and there are no guarantees, but when people come together and demand change, they can move mountains. So, what did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of someone you know? Or maybe a time when you had to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please share them in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your story could inspire someone else to make a difference. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. We've got plenty more stories that challenge, inspire, and take you on emotional journeys. Hit that subscribe button, and be a part of a community that believes in the power of storytelling to make the world a better place. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.